Before Rome learned his name, before chains closed around his wrists, there was a wide and wind-shaped land where Spartacus first breathed free air. Spartacus was born far from marble columns and shouting crowds in the rugged region known as Thrace. Here the land did not yield easily. Hills rolled into mountains, forests pressed close with dark green patience, and rivers cut their way through stone as they had for centuries. Life in this place taught endurance from the beginning. Winters were long. Summers were sharp with heat and labor. Survival was not a lesson. It was a rhythm learned from childhood. As night falls in this story, imagine a small settlement of wooden homes and smoke-darkened roofs. The scent of firewood drifts gently through the air. Somewhere, a dog stirs in its sleep. Inside one of these homes, a child listens to the low voices of elders speaking of ancestors, of battles fought and land defended, of freedom held not by law, but by will. This is the world that shaped Spartacus. Thracian life was bound closely to the land. Families worked together, hunted together, and defended one another when needed. Honor was not carved into stone or written into law. It lived in memory and reputation. A person's worth was measured by loyalty, courage, and their ability to endure hardship without complaint. Strength mattered, but so did restraint. To protect the tribe was noble. To abandon it was shameful. From an early age, Spartacus would have learned how to move quietly through forest paths, how to read the ground for signs of animals or strangers, how to listen more than he spoke. He would have known the weight of tools in his hands before he ever held a weapon. He would have felt hunger, cold, and fatigue, and learned that none of these were reasons to stop. At night, stories were told by firelight, tales of old wars, of heroes who stood against invaders, of cunning victories won through patience rather than force. These stories did not glorify conquest. They honored survival. They praised those who protected their people, who resisted domination, who valued freedom above comfort. Rome in these stories was distant, a powerful name carried on the wind, an empire that expanded like a shadow at the edge of the known world. Traders spoke of its roads and armies, its wealth and cruelty, but for a long time it remained something spoken of, not yet felt. As Spartacus grew, so did Rome's reach. Roman influence crept closer year by year, carried by soldiers, tax collectors, and treaties written in a language that meant little to those who lived beyond the empire's heart. Thrace became a land Rome wanted, but did not fully understand. Its people were strong, independent, and unwilling to bow easily. Some resisted openly. Others tried to coexist. Many were caught somewhere in between. Spartacus, by all accounts, grew into a man of remarkable physical presence. Strong shoulders shaped by labor, a steady gaze sharpened by awareness rather than arrogance. He was not born a king, nor raised as a noble. He belonged to the working world, the hunters, herdsmen, and warriors who stood when needed and returned quietly to their lives when danger passed. There are hints scattered through history that he may have served as an auxiliary soldier alongside Roman forces for a time. If so, it would not have been unusual. Rome often recruited from the very peoples it later conquered. For some, service meant pay and protection. For others, it was a temporary compromise, an uneasy alliance with a growing power. If Spartacus did serve Rome, he would have seen the empire up close. He would have watched its discipline, its order, its efficiency. He would have learned how Roman soldiers marched, how they obeyed commands without hesitation, how punishment was swift and public. He would have seen how Rome rewarded loyalty and crushed defiance. And perhaps at some point he walked away. Whether through desertion, refusal, or simple misfortune, Spartacus eventually crossed an invisible line. Rome had little patience for those who slipped from its grasp. To Rome, a man who would not submit was not a neighbor or a rival. He was a problem to be removed. Capture came swiftly. There was no heroic final stand recorded, no grand speech. History rarely preserves such moments for those without power. What remains is the silence after freedom ends, the moment when resistance becomes impossible and survival becomes the only goal. Bound and disarmed, Spartacus was taken south. The journey itself was a kind of erasure. Each step carried him farther from familiar hills, from the sound of his language, from the quiet dignity of a life lived among his own people. Roman roads were efficient, relentless, and indifferent. They carried soldiers, goods, and prisoners alike, all moving toward Rome's needs. Along the way, Spartacus would have seen others like himself, captives from different lands, each carrying a private grief. Some stared ahead in stunned silence. Others whispered of escape. Most simply walked. For Rome, slavery was not a tragedy. It was an institution. A captured enemy did not become a citizen or a prisoner of war. He became property. Markets waited at the journey's end. Here, under the open sky, men and women were inspected, priced, and sold. Strength raised value. Obedience raised it more. Resistance lowered it sharply. A man like Spartacus, strong, proud, unwilling to bend, would have been both valuable and dangerous. He did not disappear into a household or a mine. He was sent to Capua. Capua was a city of wealth and leisure, famous not for philosophy or politics, but for spectacle. Here stood one of the most notorious gladiatorial schools in the Roman world, a place where human beings were trained to fight, suffer, and die for entertainment. The Lanista who purchased Spartacus did not see a man shaped by stories and land and loyalty. He saw muscle, aggression, and potential profit. He saw a body that could be trained, disciplined, and displayed. For Spartacus, the gates of the ludus closed behind him with finality. Inside, the world narrowed. Days were governed by bells and commands. Food was measured. Movement was controlled. Names were replaced with numbers. Punishments were designed not only to hurt, but to instruct. Yet even here, traces of the old world remained. At night, when exhaustion softened the edges of pain, Spartacus lay awake listening, to breath, to whispers, to the quiet presence of others trapped beside him. Men from distant provinces, different languages, different gods, all bound by the same condition. Slavery stripped away many things, but not memory. He remembered the feel of soil beneath bare feet, the sound of wind through trees, the dignity of standing without permission. These memories did not make captivity easier, but they made submission impossible. Rome believed it could turn men into weapons and leave their spirits behind. It did not yet understand what it had taken from the forests of Thrace. And as the days passed inside the walls of Capua, something slow and steady began to form. Not rage, not yet, but resolve. A quiet, unbreakable awareness that a life lived only for another's pleasure was no life at all. Beyond these walls, the empire slept comfortably. Inside them, a story was waking. The road south was straight, hard, and unforgiving. Bound in iron and driven forward by shouted commands, Spartacus walked with dozens of others along the spine of Rome's world. The stones beneath his feet were carefully laid, fitted so tightly that even weeds struggled to rise between them. These roads were not made for comfort. They were made for control, built so armies could march quickly, so goods could move efficiently, so prisoners could be taken far from home without pause. Each step carried Spartacus farther from the hills and forests of Thrace. The air changed as they travelled. The wind lost its sharpness. The land grew warmer, more cultivated. Fields stretched outward in neat patterns, worked by hands that moved with weary familiarity. Villas appeared on distant rises, their white walls catching the sun. This was Rome's world, ordered, productive, and utterly indifferent to the lives that sustained it. The march allowed little rest. When the column stopped, it was only long enough to drink, to eat coarse bread, to sleep where they fell. Chains clinked softly with every movement, a constant reminder that even stillness belonged to someone else. At night, Spartacus lay awake beneath unfamiliar stars, listening to the quiet suffering of others. A cough held too long, a whispered prayer in a language he did not know. The low sound of weeping quickly smothered. No one spoke of rescue. Roman soldiers guarded them with practiced boredom. To these men, captives were routine. They joked among themselves, shared food, complained about the road. Their armor gleamed with regular care. Their discipline was absolute. Punishment, when needed, was swift and public, a warning delivered without emotion. Spartacus watched them closely. He noted how they walked, how they stood, how they obeyed. He saw the way commands flowed down a chain, how hesitation was corrected instantly. Rome's strength was not just in its weapons, but in its certainty. It believed the world existed to be organized, and that resistance was merely disorder waiting to be corrected. For a time, Spartacus wondered if Rome might be right, not in its cruelty, but in its inevitability. The empire felt endless on these roads. It pressed in from every direction, reshaping land and people alike. Perhaps freedom, as he had known it, was already a fading thing. Something remembered rather than lived. But memory, he discovered, could be stubborn. As the days passed, Spartacus began to notice small acts of defiance. A man who straightened his back despite exhaustion. Another who met a guard's eyes for a heartbeat longer than necessary. These gestures changed nothing, and yet they mattered. They were reminders that submission was never complete, no matter how tightly the chains were drawn. The journey ended, not with ceremony, but with noise. Capua announced itself long before its gates came into view. The air grew thick with sound. Vendors calling, animals braying, carts rattling over stone. The smell of cooked food drifted from every direction, rich and overwhelming after weeks of hardship. Life here did not pause for captives. It flowed around them, vibrant and unconcerned. The market was crowded. Buyers moved among the chained captives with professional detachment, lifting chins, pressing fingers into muscles, inspecting teeth and scars. Prices were discussed openly. Strength was assessed. Potential calculated. Spartacus stood still, jaw set, refusing to shrink. His posture drew attention. A lanista, a dealer in gladiators, paused before him. This man's eyes were sharp, calculating. He saw what others did not just yet. Not a laborer, not a servant, but a fighter. Someone who could be shaped into spectacle. The decision was quick. With the exchange of coin, Spartacus passed from one form of captivity into another. He was no longer simply enslaved. He was an investment. The gates of the gladiator school in Capua rose high and solid, their wood reinforced with iron. Inside, the noise of the city fell away, replaced by the sharper sounds of discipline, shouted orders, the crack of a staff against flesh, the rhythmic thud of bodies striking sand. This place was designed to strip away hesitation. The first days were a blur of rules and routines, heads shaved, bodies washed and inspected, names replaced with records, food provided in precise measure, enough to sustain strength, never enough to satisfy, sleep allowed, but never guaranteed. Training began immediately. At first, it was not about combat. It was about obedience, learning when to move, when to stop, when to endure pain without reaction. Instructors watched closely, correcting posture, stance, breathing. Mistakes were punished, not out of cruelty alone, but to condition response. Pain was a language here, and everyone was expected to understand it fluently. Spartacus learned quickly. His body adapted to the regimen with surprising speed. Muscles hardened, movements sharpened. He absorbed instruction not as submission, but as information. Every technique, every drill, every correction became knowledge stored carefully away. At night, as the others slept, he replayed the day's lessons in his mind. Not to prepare for the arena, but to understand the system that had claimed him. Around him, bonds formed quietly. Men from Gaul, from Germania, from Africa and the East shared food, whispered stories, traded fragments of home. They spoke of families left behind, of gods who might still be listening, of escape, always escape, spoken softly, as if saying it too loudly might make it impossible. Spartacus listened more than he spoke. He saw how despair settled differently on each man. Some grew reckless, eager for death rather than endurance. Others became compliant, hoping obedience might buy safety. A few, like him, remained watchful, waiting. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. Over time, Spartacus began to understand the rhythms of the school. When guards changed, when supervision loosened, which instructors relied on habit rather than awareness, which men were trusted and which were feared. Fear, he learned, was the truest measure of power here. Rome believed gladiators were controlled by spectacle, by reward, by the promise of survival in exchange for violence. And for many, this was true. But Spartacus felt something different growing inside him. Not a hunger for glory, but a refusal to be reduced. He had been taken from his land, stripped of his name, trained to kill for the pleasure of strangers. But he was still watching, still remembering. Beyond the walls of Capua, Rome continued its routines, elections, banquets, festivals. The city celebrated order and stability, unaware of the quiet calculations being made behind closed gates. Inside the school, iron pressed down on every hour. Yet iron, Spartacus knew, could be shaped, heated, broken. The weight of Roman power was immense, but it rested on the belief that those beneath it would never rise together. As Spartacus lay awake one night, listening to the slow breathing of the men around him, a thought settled into place with surprising calm. Rome had taught him how it fought. Now, it was teaching him how it could be challenged. And though no plans were spoken yet, the silence between these men was beginning to change, thickening with possibility. heavy with a future Rome had not imagined. The road that had carried Spartacus south had not ended at Capua. It had only narrowed. Morning arrived in Capua, not with birdsong, but with command. A sharp knock against wood, a shouted order, the clatter of chains being unfastened. Inside the gladiator school, the ludus sleep ended abruptly, as it always did. There was no lingering between dreams and waking here. The body was expected to rise at once, to remember where it was before the mind could wander anywhere else. For Spartacus, each dawn began the same way, feet on cold stone, the smell of sweat and oil in the air, and the quiet understanding that survival depended on attention. In this place, inattention invited pain. The school was built like a fortress turned inward. High walls shut out the city, not to protect the gladiators, but to contain them. Within those walls, the world was reduced to sand, stone, and iron. Yards for training, cells for sleeping, armories locked behind heavy doors. Everything had a purpose, and that purpose was spectacle. Training consumed most of the day. The instructors, former gladiators themselves, moved among the men with practiced authority. They carried wooden staffs and used them freely. Their voices were hoarse from years of shouting over clashing weapons. They taught stance, balance, timing. They corrected mistakes immediately, sometimes with words, more often with blows. At first, the weapons were wooden, heavy practice swords designed to exhaust rather than cut. The weight forced the body to adapt, to grow stronger without mercy. Every drill repeated the same lesson. Control your body, or it will betray you. Pain was constant but not chaotic. It was administered with intention. Spartacus learned to accept it without flinching. Not because it hurt less, but because reacting gave the instructors something they wanted: proof of dominance. He kept his face still, his breathing steady, his focus sharp. This restraint earned him fewer punishments and closer scrutiny. Close scrutiny, he understood, was a double-edged thing. The men trained in groups divided by fighting-style Thracians, Gauls, Mumilios, Retiarii. Each was taught to embody a role, a recognizable figure in the Roman imagination. The arena demanded familiarity. It demanded drama. To Rome, gladiators were not individuals. They were characters. Spartacus, trained in the Thracian style, was given curved blades and a small shield. The equipment echoed weapons from his homeland, but stripped of context and meaning. What had once been tools of defense and survival were now instruments of entertainment. He mastered them anyway, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Skill meant survival. Skill bought time. Time allowed thought. Between drills, Spartacus watched the others. He noticed how some men embraced the role Rome had written for them. They boasted of future victories, imagined cheers, clung to the idea that fame might soften the edges of captivity. Others retreated inward, conserving energy, speaking little, eyes dulled by routine. And then there were those who resisted in quieter ways. A Gaul who deliberately trained slower, saving strength. A German who pretended ignorance to avoid attention. A Syrian who memorized guard patterns with unsettling precision. These men did not speak openly of defiance, but their silence carried weight. Meals were taken together under watchful eyes. Thick porridge, beans, bread. Food meant to build muscle quickly, to keep bodies strong enough for the arena. It was nourishment without comfort. Enough to live, never enough to forget. In these moments, When weapons were set aside, conversations surfaced cautiously. Men spoke of where they came from, of rivers, of mountains, of cities now unreachable. They shared names of gods under their breath. Some spoke of families left behind, though doing so often ended in silence, the weight of memory pressing too hard. Spartacus listened. He did not lead these conversations. He did not dominate them. But when he spoke, others leaned closer. His words were measured, his observations clear. He did not promise escape. He did not stir false hope. He simply acknowledged what they all felt, that this life was not meant to be accepted. The guards noticed this too. Attention followed him more often now. His movements were tracked, his progress recorded. The Lannister saw profit in him, a fighter who learned quickly, who endured without breaking, who might one day draw a crowd. That prospect filled Spartacus with a cold, steady resolve. The arena loomed in the distance, even if he had not yet seen it. Every drill, every scar, every lesson pointed toward that future moment when gates would open and the crowd would roar. Rome believed this was the culmination of a gladiator's existence, the instant when fear and glory merged into meaning. Spartacus did not share that belief. At night, after exhaustion finally quieted the school, the men returned to their cells. The space was cramped, the air stale. Sleep came unevenly. Some men dreamed loudly. Others lay awake, staring into darkness. Spartacus used these hours to think. He mapped the school in his mind, the timing of patrols, the habits of guards, the locks that were treated carelessly, the moments when routine dulled vigilance. He also thought about the men themselves. A rebellion could not be built on anger alone. Anger flared and burned out. What endured was trust earned slowly, through shared hardship and quiet recognition. Spartacus began to understand who might stand firm under pressure and who might falter. There was no single moment when escape became inevitable. It emerged gradually, like a shape forming in fog. The school believed it controlled every aspect of the gladiators' lives. And in many ways, it did. But control bred predictability. Predictability created weakness. As weeks turned into months, Spartacus felt the balance shifting. He had entered Capua as a captive, stripped of choice. He was becoming something else, a man who understood his captors as well as they understood him. A man who could see beyond the walls, not as an abstract dream, but as a reachable horizon. Still, patience was essential. Rome punished failure mercilessly. Any attempt at escape would need to be decisive. Hesitation would mean death not only for the one who tried, but for many who had no say in the matter. So Spartacus waited. He trained. He endured. He watched. And within the house of death, where Rome believed it had perfected control, something fragile and dangerous was taking shape, a shared awareness among men who had been told they were alone. The walls of Capua stood tall and confident, bathed each day in Italian sun. They didn't yet know they were being measured. The first whispers did not sound like rebellion. They sounded like questions asked too softly to be punished. Inside the gladiator school at Capua, days continued to pass in their rigid rhythm training, discipline, exhaustion, sleep. To the guards and instructors, nothing had changed. The men rose when commanded, fought when ordered, endured when struck. The system appeared intact, humming along as it always had. But beneath the noise of routine, something subtle had shifted. For Spartacus, the change revealed itself not in words, but in glances. in pauses that lingered a moment longer than necessary, in the way certain men chose to sit closer together during meals, lowering their voices instinctively, even when no guard was near. The school was a place where listening mattered more than speaking. At first, the whispers came as fragments, unfinished thoughts shared in the brief spaces between supervision. A muttered observation about a guard who drank too much. A note about a door left unsecured during training hours. A quiet comment about how the kitchen knives were counted only at night. No one spoke of escape directly. Not yet. To do so too early would have been dangerous. Hope, when spoken aloud, could become reckless. Spartacus understood this. He let the whispers circulate without guiding them, without shaping them. He wanted to know which men thought carefully, which spoke impulsively, which listened before reacting. Trust, he knew, was not declared. It was revealed. As days passed, patterns emerged. The same few men lingered near one another whenever possible. A Gaul with scarred arms and steady eyes. A German whose silence concealed constant awareness. A pair of brothers from the eastern provinces who communicated with glances more than words. Spartacus did not gather them together. He let them find one another. When he did speak, it was never about freedom as an idea. It was about conditions. How many guards after dusk? Which instructor watches the armory? When are supplies delivered? Questions asked as if out of idle curiosity. The men answered carefully. They did not realize at first that they were building something together. They believed they were merely sharing observations, easing the monotony of captivity. But knowledge, once shared, does not remain small. Night became the most important hour. After the final inspection, when the school settled into uneasy quiet, the men lay on their pallets, listening to the sounds of the place. The distant clink of chains, the pacing of guards, the low murmur of the city beyond the walls. Capua slept lightly, never fully silent. Spartacus lay awake, eyes open in the dark. He replayed each whispered detail in his mind, fitting them together like pieces of a map. He imagined paths through the school not as corridors, but as moments when vigilance softened, when habit replaced awareness. The guards relied on fear to maintain control. They believed the gladiators were too divided, too exhausted, too isolated to act together. And for years, this belief had been correct. But something about this group was different. Perhaps it was the diversity of their origins. Perhaps it was the sheer number of men who had known freedom before Rome took it away. Or perhaps it was simply timing the accumulation of injustice reaching a quiet breaking point. Whatever the cause, the whispers grew bolder. One night, a Gaul spoke the word aloud for the first time. Out! It was barely more than breath. No one responded immediately. Silence pressed in, heavy and dangerous. Spartacus waited, letting the moment pass without interference. Then he shifted slightly and spoke, his voice low and steady. Not yet. The Gaul turned toward him in the dark. Then when? When it can work, Spartacus replied. That answer satisfied more than it disappointed. From then on, the whispers changed tone. They became more deliberate, more restrained. The men understood now that escape was not fantasy, but it was not imminent either. It would require patience greater than their suffering. Training continued, but Spartacus noticed a difference. Men pushed themselves not for the instructors, but for each other. They learned each other's strengths, compensated for weaknesses. Bonds formed not through declarations, but through shared endurance. Rome trained gladiators to fight alone in front of crowds. Spartacus was shaping something else entirely. He began to test trust in small ways, asking one man to watch another's back during a drill, sharing food discreetly with someone who had been punished, intervening calmly when tempers flared, preventing conflict before it drew attention. Each act reinforced a quiet truth. Survival here no longer depended solely on obedience. The kitchen became a focal point of whispered attention. Unlike the armory, it was not heavily guarded. Knives were common tools, not weapons at least in Roman thinking. Food preparation required speed and volume, which meant oversight was often rushed. Counted at night, ignored during the day. A mistake born of confidence. Spartacus said nothing about it for weeks. He allowed others to notice it independently. When the realization spread without his prompting, he knew the moment was approaching. Still, doubt lingered. Some men feared the consequences more than captivity. They had seen what happened to those who resisted. Bodies broken. Punishments designed to terrify the rest. Rome excelled at making examples. Spartacus did not dismiss these fears. Instead, he spoke of certainty. Staying guarantees nothing, he said quietly one evening. Leaving changes everything. There was no fire in his voice, no stirring speech, just a statement of fact. Gradually, the group solidified. Not everyone would join them. Some men chose survival through compliance. Others lacked the strength or will. Spartacus accepted this. A failed escape burdened by hesitation would doom them all. Better fewer men who were resolute than many who were afraid. The plan, when it finally took shape, was simple. Simplicity was its strength. There would be no drawn-out struggle, no attempt to seize the school, only speed, surprise, and unity. Weapons would be taken where they could be found. The walls would be crossed by means Rome never expected. They would not fight Rome as gladiators. They would flee as men. The night chosen was unremarkable. No festival, no distraction. Just another evening in Capua. Routine dulled attention better than celebration ever could. As darkness settled, Spartacus felt the weight of the moment press gently against his chest. Not fear, but awareness. This was the point beyond which there would be no return. Success would bring pursuit. Failure would bring death. He looked at the men around him not as fighters, not as slaves, but as individuals bound by shared choice. Their faces were calm, determined, ready. The whispers ceased. Silence took their place. And within that silence, the house of death held its breath, unaware that its foundations were about to be tested, not by force, but by resolve. The knives were closer than Rome believed, and freedom, long imagined in fragments, was about to demand everything. The night did not announce itself as different. Capua settled as it always did. Lanterns dimmed, voices softened, the heat of the day lingering in stone walls that had absorbed the sun's warmth. Inside the gladiator school, routine carried on with practiced certainty. Guards changed posts, instructors retired, locks were checked, then trusted. Rome relied on habit. For Spartacus, this was the signal they had been waiting for. There was no spoken command, no raised hand. Each man moved when the moment reached him, guided by weeks of shared understanding rather than orders. The first step was the hardest, not because it required courage, but because it required leaving behind the safety of familiarity. however brutal that safety had been. The kitchen lay at the heart of the school, busy during daylight, neglected after dusk. Its purpose was nourishment, not security. Roman thinking divided the world cleanly. Weapons belonged in armories, danger in battlefields. Tools were not threats, slaves were not strategists. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old grain and cooled embers. Moonlight slipped through a high opening, illuminating rough tables and stacked baskets. Knives lay where they had been left ordinary, unremarkable, trusted. Spartacus reached one first. The weight of it was different from the wooden swords of training. Shorter, sharper, honest. It was not designed for spectacle, but for use. Around him, others did the same, hands steady, movements quiet. No one rushed. Panic had no place here. A guard's footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor beyond. Spartacus raised his hand not in warning, but in calm instruction. They waited. Breath slowed. Muscles held. When the steps faded, movement resumed. This was not chaos. It was discipline of another kind. The first confrontation was brief. A lone guard rounded a corner, eyes already half-lidded with expectation. He had walked these halls countless times without incident. The sight before him, gladiators armed and advancing, did not register until it was too late. There was no cruelty in what followed, no hesitation either. The guard fell silently, more surprised than afraid. His keys were taken, his weapon claimed, his body lowered gently to the stone floor. Even now, Spartacus would not allow wasteful violence. Speed mattered. Silence mattered more. Doors opened that had never opened without permission. Men poured into corridors that had always been forbidden, moving with purpose sharpened by restraint. The school, so carefully designed to contain them, suddenly revealed its flaws. Too many corners, too much reliance on routine, too much confidence in fear. Another guard shouted. The sound broke the night open. What followed was not the clean execution of a perfect plan. It was movement adapting to resistance. Shouts rang out, feet pounded, metal clashed briefly in confined spaces, but surprise remained their greatest ally. Guards accustomed to control hesitated when faced with unity. Spartacus fought only when necessary. His focus was not on domination, but on passage. Clear the way. Keep moving. Preserve momentum. The men followed him instinctively, not because he commanded, but because he saw what they could not paths forward, moments of opportunity. They reached the armory. This was the point of no return. The door was locked, reinforced, guarded by two men already alert. There was no subtlety left to attempt. Spartacus assessed the space, the angles, the timing, and acted. The fight was swift and decisive. When the door finally opened, the sight inside changed everything. Real weapons, shields, armor, tools of war stacked and ready. The men armed themselves quickly, efficiently, as if they had been waiting their entire lives for this moment. Perhaps they had. By now, alarms rang through Capua. The school was fully awake. Guards regrouped, forming defensive lines near the main gate. Torches flared, throwing long shadows across the courtyard. For a moment, it seemed the escape might end here in a final, desperate clash. Spartacus did not charge the gate. He turned instead toward the walls. Rope was found, bedding torn and twisted, hooks fashioned from scraps of iron. The plan unfolded not because it had been rehearsed in detail, but because it had been imagined together. Rome expected men to think only of doors. It had forgotten to consider heights. The first climbers moved quickly, hands gripping rough stone, muscles straining under unfamiliar freedom. Arrows flew but poorly aimed. Guards shouted orders over one another, struggling to respond to a threat that did not fit their expectations. When the first man dropped safely to the other side, a sound rose, not a cheer, but a sharp, breathless laugh. The sound of disbelief turning into reality. Spartacus climbed among the last. From the top, he looked back once. The school lay in confusion below, torches scattered, guards shouting, shadows darting across the sand, where so many men had trained and bled. This place had been designed to end stories, not begin them. He did not linger. The descent was rough, the landing hard. But when Spartacus straightened, he stood on open ground beyond Rome's control for the first time since his capture. One by one, the others joined him. They did not stop to count. They did not pause to celebrate. The city lay ahead, sprawling and dangerous. Pursuit would come quickly. Freedom, like captivity, demanded movement. They ran. Through darkened streets, past sleeping homes, over uneven ground that scraped feet and tore breath from lungs unaccustomed to haste without command. Dogs barked. Doors opened briefly, then shut again. Capua stirred, confused and alarmed. At the edge of the city, they slowed. The countryside stretched out before them, vast and uncertain. Fields and hills rolled into darkness, offering concealment, but no promise of safety. Behind them, Rome gathered itself, preparing to respond. Spartacus turned to face the men. In the dim light, their faces were transformed not by triumph, but by something quieter and deeper. Relief, awe, fear, possibility. They were no longer gladiators. They were fugitives, weapons in hand, breath ragged, hearts pounding with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. They stood together on the threshold of a future no one had planned in detail, but all had chosen. Behind them, the house of death burned with confusion. Ahead, the night opened wide, and Rome, for the first time, had lost something it believed it owned. Dawn found them hidden among vines and broken stone, breathing hard as the countryside slowly revealed itself. The men who had fled Capua, no longer gladiators, not yet an army, took shelter on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The mountain loomed quietly above them, its peak often wreathed in mist, its sides tangled with wild growth. To the Romans below, it was an unremarkable presence, a landmark, a backdrop to fertile land. To the fugitives, it became refuge. For Spartacus, the mountain felt familiar, not in form, but in spirit. Like the hills of Thrace, it offered concealment, difficult paths, and vantage points from which to observe without being seen. The men climbed higher, away from roads and farms, settling where the terrain itself discouraged pursuit. They did not light fires at first. Silence and stillness were their allies. From above, they watched the Roman response unfold. Soldiers poured from Capua, spreading across the countryside in disciplined lines. Scouts searched the roads. Orders were shouted, repeated, obeyed. Rome moved with speed, but also with assumption. It assumed the fugitives would flee blindly. They did not. Spartacus gathered the men quietly. No speech, no proclamation, just shared attention focused on the same reality. They could not outrun Rome forever. Movement alone would lead them back into chains. Survival required something more difficult, holding ground without becoming trapped. The mountain provided that opportunity. Food was scarce at first. They foraged carefully, learning what could be eaten, what could be traded. Nearby farms offered supplies taken swiftly and selectively, never enough to draw immediate retaliation, never so little as to invite starvation. Discipline mattered now more than ever. Chaos would expose them. More men began to arrive. Runaway slaves, shepherds, labourers who had heard whispers of the escape and followed the signs left behind, broken chains, stolen supplies, Roman patrols searching too urgently. These newcomers arrived fearful and uncertain, but hopeful. Spartacus accepted them cautiously. Not everyone who came could fight. Not everyone should. But each person carried a story Rome had ignored. The group grew not through conquest, but through gravity. The mountain pulled them together. Rome responded by sending a small force, confident, dismissive. The commander believed the rebels were cornered. After all, Mount Vesuvius had only one obvious path down. The Roman troops marched up that path and made camp, convinced starvation would finish what steel might not. From below, they could not see the hidden routes, the narrow descents, the tangled vines. They did not understand the land they had chosen to surround. Spartacus did. Under cover of darkness, he led a group down the mountain's steepest side, using ropes fashioned from vines and fabric. The descent was dangerous, but silent. The men moved like shadows, slipping past Roman positions unseen. By dawn, they were behind the Roman camp. What followed was swift and decisive. The Roman soldiers, unprepared and outmaneuvered, broke quickly. Weapons were seized, supplies captured. The rebels melted back into the mountain before reinforcements could arrive. The victory was small, but its meaning was enormous. Rome had been beaten by men it had dismissed as property. News spread faster than soldiers could march. Stories changed with every retelling, growing larger, more dangerous. A slave army, a leader who understood Roman tactics, a force the empire could not easily predict. On the mountain, the mood shifted. The men were no longer simply survivors. They were fighters with proof of possibility. Confidence settled in, not loud or reckless, but steady. They trained now not as gladiators, but as equals. Skills were shared. Roles assigned based on ability, not origin. Spartacus led without ceremony. He listened. He observed. He intervened only when necessary. Authority came not from dominance, but from clarity. When he spoke, it was because something needed to be said. He reminded them often. Rome would return in greater strength. What they had won was time, not safety. Yet even as danger loomed, something rare existed on that mountain. Choice. Men chose when to fight, when to rest, when to move. Even fear felt different when it belonged to oneself. Fires were lit now, carefully shielded. Food was cooked and shared. Stories were told, not just of suffering, but of home. Laughter returned in cautious bursts, surprising everyone who heard it. Below, Rome reorganized. This was no longer a matter for local guards. The Senate took notice. Commanders argued over strategy. Pride stung deeply. An empire that ruled the Mediterranean could not allow escaped slaves to win battles, no matter how small. But up on Mount Vesuvius, Rome felt far away. The rebels looked out over the land, watching roads and towns they had once moved through invisibly. Now they were seen, spoken of, feared, misjudged. The world had shifted just slightly, and that shift could not be undone. Spartacus stood apart one evening, watching the firelight flicker across unfamiliar faces, now bound to him by circumstance and choice. This was never the plan. And yet, here they were. The mountain held them for now, sheltering something Rome could not easily name, a force born not from conquest, but from refusal. The fire on Mount Vesuvius burned low against the darkening sky, and Rome, uneasy and insulted, began to understand that this was not an escape that would quietly end. The mountain could not hold them forever. As days turned into weeks on the slopes of Vesuvius, the truth became unavoidable. The rebels were growing not just in number, but in presence. Smoke from their fires was harder to hide. Roman patrols moved more frequently below. Messengers carried increasingly urgent reports south and north alike. Rome was paying attention now. For Spartacus, this attention was both danger and opportunity. The mountain had given them their first victory, their first breath of control. But remaining in one place would invite containment, not conquest. Rome excelled at sieges. It learned from mistakes. So Spartacus made a decision that surprised many. They would leave the mountain. The descent was deliberate, not hurried. The men moved in organized groups, taking what they could carry, destroying what they could not. They did not flee like hunted animals. They marched like people who had chosen their direction. Below, the countryside responded. As they moved, more joined them, runaway slaves from farms and villas, labourers from workshops, shepherds from hills who had heard the stories and seen the signs. Some came cautiously, unsure whether the rumours were true. Others arrived openly, desperate and ready. The group grew into something that no longer fit its original name. It was not a band of fugitives anymore. It was not an army either, at least not in the Roman sense. There were no uniforms, no banners, no shared language or culture. Men came from Gaul, Thrace, Germania, Africa, the eastern provinces. They carried different gods, different customs, different memories of freedom. What they shared was refusal. Spartacus understood the fragility of this unity. Rome built armies through pay, discipline, and law. This force had none of those things. It survived on trust and purpose alone, both easily broken. So he focused first on order, not expansion. Groups were organized by ability. Fighters trained fighters. Non-combatants handled food, care, and movement. Decisions were discussed openly when possible, enforced firmly when necessary. Theft within the group was punished. Violence between members was not tolerated. Freedom, Spartacus believed, did not mean disorder. Training became constant. Captured Roman weapons were distributed carefully. Techniques were adapted, not copied blindly. Spartacus taught them what he had learned in the ludus and on the road, how Romans formed lines, how they advanced, how they broke when surprised. He emphasized movement over rigidity, adaptability over pride. These men would never outmatch Rome in discipline, but they could outthink it. Victories followed small at first, then bolder. Roman detachments sent to suppress them were ambushed, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed by numbers and unpredictability. Supply wagons disappeared. Roads became unsafe. Villages whispered warnings before Roman troops arrived. Each success drew more attention and more people. With growth came tension. Some wanted to march directly on Rome, intoxicated by momentum. Others argued for escape north, toward the Alps, and out of Italy altogether. Many simply followed, trusting Spartacus to decide. He listened, He knew they were standing at a crossroads far larger than any single battle. To challenge Rome directly would mean open war against the most powerful state in the known world. To flee would mean abandoning countless others still in chains. There was no choice without cost. For now, Spartacus delayed the decision. They moved instead through southern Italy, striking where Rome was weakest, avoiding fortified cities, dismantling the illusion of control in the countryside. Each step spread uncertainty. Each victory forced Rome to commit more resources, more men, more attention. The Senate argued. Some dismissed the rebels as a temporary nuisance. Others warned of precedent what it would mean if slaves across Italy believed resistance could succeed. Rome was built on hierarchy. Shake its foundation, and everything above trembled. Winter approached, and with it, hardship. Food became harder to secure. The men endured cold nights, shortages, exhaustion. Not everyone survived. Illness claimed some, desertion claimed others. The strain tested the fragile bonds that held the group together. Spartacus addressed them rarely, but when he did, it was not with promises of victory. It was with honesty. "This is not easy," he said once, standing before a gathered crowd. "It was never meant to be, but it is ours." That was enough. The idea of ownership, not of land, not of power, but of choice, sustained them through the worst nights. By now, Rome had committed real commanders. Consuls took the field, eager to claim glory by crushing the uprising. Their defeats shocked the Republic. Armies trained for foreign wars struggled against men who refused to fight by expected rules. Each Roman loss fed the legend. Spartacus became more than a leader. He became a symbol feared by elites, revered by the enslaved, misunderstood by both. Stories exaggerated his size, his strength, his intentions. Rome tried to define him as a monster, a criminal, a threat to order. But among his people, he was something simpler. He was the one who listened, the one who remembered names, the one who did not ask them to bow. Still, the question could not be avoided forever. They could not roam Italy endlessly. Rome's patience was wearing thin. Sooner or later, the Republic would send its full strength not to punish, but to annihilate. One evening, as the camp settled and fires burned low, Spartacus stood watching the men he had come to lead. They were laughing softly, sharing food, repairing armor, teaching one another words from their languages. An army without a nation, but not without humanity. Whatever came next would test everything they had built. The road ahead was narrowing again, and the choice Spartacus would soon make would decide not only their fate, but how Rome would remember them, long after the dust of their footsteps had faded from the Italian roads. By the time Rome truly understood what was happening, the damage was already done. At first, reports had arrived in fragments confused, contradictory, easy to dismiss. A patrol missing, a supply convoy ambushed, a village refusing entry to Roman soldiers until reinforcements arrived. These were inconveniences, not crises. Italy was vast. Order always reasserted itself. But as weeks passed, the fragments began to align. Defeated detachments returned with the same story. Men without uniforms, moving quickly, striking where expected least. They spoke of discipline without drill, of formations that dissolved and reformed at will. And always at the center of these accounts, a name surfaced again and again. Spartacus. In the Senate, the name was spoken with irritation at first. then with unease. This was not how rebellions behaved. Slaves did not defeat Roman forces in open ground. They did not think strategically. They didn't inspire coordination across regions. Rome's confidence rested on assumptions that were beginning to fail. The Republic responded, as it always had, to perceived disorder, with escalation. Consular armies were raised, commanded by men eager to restore honor and secure political advancement. To crush a slave revolt was not seen as dangerous duty, but as opportunity. Victory would be swift, reputations polished, Rome reassured. The first major engagement was meant to end the matter. The Roman commander advanced with confidence, expecting a disorganized mass. He prepared for a frontal confrontation, lines drawn cleanly, discipline enforced. What he encountered instead was absence. The rebels were gone. They struck from the sides, from behind, from terrain the Romans had considered impassable. Confusion spread. Orders conflicted. Formations broke. The battle ended not with annihilation, but with retreat, a Roman retreat, unheard of in Italy itself. The shock rippled outward. Merchants delayed travel. Landowners fortified villas. Slaves listened more closely than before. Each Roman defeat made the idea of resistance feel less like fantasy and more like precedent. Spartacus understood the danger of this moment. Momentum was intoxicating. Victory bred confidence, and confidence risked recklessness. He knew Rome would adapt. It always did. The Republic's greatest strength was not invincibility, but persistence. So he changed tactics. The rebels did not seek decisive confrontation. They struck quickly and withdrew. They avoided cities, dismantled supply lines, and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. They moved constantly, forcing Rome to chase rather than plan. The effect was exhausting. Roman armies were trained for set-piece battles, for clear objectives. Chasing an enemy that refused to be cornered strained logistics and morale. Soldiers marched without engagement, camped without certainty, slept with weapons close at hand. Fear crept in, not panic, but doubt. Who were these men? How many were there? Where would they strike next? Meanwhile, the rebel force continued to swell. Spartacus did not advertise their presence, but rumor traveled faster than banners ever could. Slaves fled at night, following roads whispered about in kitchens and fields. Some arrived armed. Others came with nothing but desperation. All were changed by what they found not chaos but structure. This was not a mob. It was an alternative. Rome watched this growth with increasing alarm. The issue was no longer just military, it was ideological. The Republic's economy depended on slavery. Its social order assumed submission. To allow a successful uprising, even a temporary one, was to invite questions Rome could not afford to answer. So Rome awoke fully. More legions were summoned. Experienced commanders were consulted. The tone in the Senate shifted from annoyance to urgency. This was no longer a nuisance to be managed, but a threat to be eliminated completely. Spartacus felt the tightening net. Scouts reported increased troop movements. Roads once lightly guarded now bristled with soldiers. Cities closed gates preemptively. Rome was preparing not just to fight, but to trap. The rebels gathered one evening as the reality set in. They stood at another crossroads. To continue fighting in Italy meant eventual confrontation with overwhelming force. To attempt escape northward to cross the Alps and scatter offered survival, but at the cost of abandoning the struggle here. The group was divided. Some wanted to leave while they could. Freedom lay beyond Rome's borders. Others argued that turning back now would betray those who had joined them, those who believed something greater was possible. Spartacus listened to both sides. He understood the weight of leadership now more than ever. Every decision affected thousands of lives, not just his own. There were no good choices left, only necessary ones. For now he chose delay. They would move north, but not flee blindly. They would remain dangerous, unpredictable, present. Rome would not be allowed to choose the terms of engagement so easily. Winter deepened. The land grew harsh. Hunger tested discipline. Rome pressed harder. Still, the rebels endured. In camp after camp, Spartacus walked among the men, speaking quietly, listening more than he commanded. He reminded them of what they had already accomplished, not in grand victories, but in simple truths. They had forced Rome to respond. They had broken the illusion of inevitability. They had lived as free people, if only briefly. That alone had changed the world. Somewhere south, Roman commanders prepared their next move, determined not to underestimate the enemy again. They would bring walls, traps, and patience. They would fight this war not with speed, but with suffocation. Rome had awakened at last. But it had awakened late to a reality it could no longer undo. And as the rebels moved through the cold Italian nights, carrying with them fear, hope, and unfinished choices, the Republic began to realize that this was no longer a story it controlled. The next phase would demand sacrifice from both sides, and Rome, for all its power, would soon learn that even an empire cannot wake from a dream without consequence. The road north was colder, quieter, and heavier with uncertainty. As winter tightened its grip on Italy, the rebel force moved steadily toward the distant outline of the Alps, those vast, pale mountains that marked the edge of Rome's world. Beyond them lay lands the Republic did not fully command, places where Roman law thinned and freedom might once again be possible. For Spartacus, the mountains were more than geography. They were an idea, a threshold, a promise whispered in every tired step. Many believed this had always been the goal, to leave Italy, to go home if home still existed, to scatter beyond Rome's reach and survive. The dream was simple, and that was its power. As they marched, the men spoke of what lay beyond the Alps. Gauls described river valleys and forests where Rome's grip weakened. Thracians imagined familiar hills, languages once spoken freely. Others had no homes to return to, but believed that anywhere beyond Rome must be better than the life they had known. Spartacus listened to these dreams with care. He did not dismiss them. He did not encourage them blindly either. He understood that dreams could sustain a march, but they could also fracture a movement if reality failed to match expectation. The force had grown large now, too large to vanish quietly. Tens of thousands moved with him. Fighters, non-combatants, families who had attached themselves to the column seeking protection. The logistics of survival pressed harder each day. Food was scarce, supplies unreliable, discipline harder to maintain as exhaustion set in. Rome followed, not always in sight, but always present. Scouts reported legions shadowing their movements, avoiding engagement, waiting. Roman commanders were learning. They no longer rushed into traps. They watched, measured, adapted. The rebels won small victories still, but the tone had changed. This was no longer a chase. It was a narrowing corridor. As they approached northern Italy, the debate intensified. Should they continue toward the Alps and escape while they still could? Or should they turn back south, carrying the war deeper into Roman territory while momentum remained? The camp was divided. Those who had joined early gladiators, hardened fighters, were more willing to continue the struggle. They had already crossed too many lines to imagine quiet lives beyond the mountains. Others, especially the newly freed, wanted only safety. They feared Rome's inevitable retaliation more than they trusted the promise of continued resistance. Spartacus felt the weight of both sides. Leadership now meant choosing which hope would survive and which would be sacrificed. One evening, as snow dusted the ground and fires burned low, Spartacus addressed a gathering of representatives from the groups. There was no stage, no elevation. He stood among them, wrapped in a worn cloak, his voice steady against the cold. "Beyond the mountains," he said, "there is space. Not peace, but space." Murmurs followed. "But Rome will not forget us," he continued. "Wherever we go, it will remember that we walked away." Silence settled in. He spoke then of reality, not of glory, not of destiny. He spoke of children in the camp, of the wounded, of the exhausted. He acknowledged the fear that hung over them all like the winter sky. "This began as escape," he said. "It became something else because we survived together." He did not say what that something else was. He let them decide. The choice, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. They would turn back, not all the way south, not toward Rome itself, but toward continued resistance within Italy. Some groups chose to leave then, breaking away in smaller bands, heading for the mountains on their own. Spartacus did not stop them. Freedom meant accepting divergence. Those who remained did so with open eyes. The decision altered everything. Turning back meant abandoning the clearest path to safety. It meant choosing danger in the present over uncertain peace in the distance. Rome would interpret this not as desperation, but as defiance. Spartacus understood the message it sent. The rebels moved south again, striking Roman positions with renewed intensity. The land they crossed bore the marks of earlier battles, burned camps, trampled fields, abandoned roads. Each return step reminded them of how far they had already gone. Rome responded with resolve. The Senate's patience had ended. No longer would inexperienced commanders be sent to contain the uprising. The Republic needed someone ruthless, methodical, immune to panic. Someone who could end this without hesitation. Whispers of a new commander reached the rebel camps of wealth, of discipline, of a man who understood not just battle, but fear itself. His name traveled ahead of him, carried by deserters and scouts. Crassus. Spartacus did not underestimate what was coming. He reorganized the force again, tightening command where possible, reinforcing discipline. He knew they would soon face an enemy who would not rush, who would not be baited, who would be willing to sacrifice time and men to secure absolute victory. The dream of the Alps did not vanish. It lingered quietly, like a door left ajar in memory. For some, it remained a source of regret. For others, a future that might still be reached if fate allowed. But for now, the path lay southward into confrontation. As the rebels marched beneath grey winter skies, Spartacus walked at their head, not as a conqueror, not as a king, but as a man carrying the accumulated choices of thousands. They had stood at freedom's edge. And instead of stepping through alone, they had turned back together. Rome would not forgive that, and the war, now stripped of illusion, moved toward its most unforgiving chapter. Winter pressed down on Italy like a held breath. Frost clung to the ground in the mornings, and the nights grew long and restless. For Rome, winter usually meant Poor's armies withdrew, campaigns slowed, and the machinery of war waited for spring. But this war did not follow Rome's habits. It refused to rest. For Spartacus and those who followed him, winter became a season of testing and, unexpectedly, of strength. They moved through southern and central Italy with a rhythm Rome struggled to predict. Cold hardened the men, sharpened their focus. Supplies were harder to find, but discipline made the difference. No village was stripped bare. No raid was careless. The rebels learned to take only what they needed, leaving less reason for immediate retaliation and fewer clues to follow. Roman forces pursued cautiously now. Earlier arrogance had been replaced with restraint. Commanders avoided rash engagements, preferring to shadow the rebels, probing for weakness. But this caution worked both ways. The rebels learned to exploit hesitation just as effectively as they once exploited confidence. Several Roman detachments fell that winter, not in great sweeping battles, but in sharp, sudden encounters. A column caught crossing a narrow pass, a camp surprised at dawn, a supply train disappearing into wooded hills, its guards scattered before they could form ranks. Each victory mattered, not because it brought Rome closer to defeat, but because it proved the rebels could survive even under growing pressure. Morale strengthened. Stories spread again, carried quietly from farm to town to city. Rome's control, once taken for granted, felt thinner now. Within the rebel camp, something rare took shape: order. Not the rigid imposed order of Rome, but an organic structure shaped by necessity. Fighters rotated duties. Guards were posted reliably. Training continued, even when exhaustion tempted rest. Disputes were resolved quickly, without spectacle. Spartacus encouraged this not through command, but through example. He rose early. He walked the camp at night. He listened. Leadership, he understood, was not about being seen. It was about being trusted. The army, if it could now be called that, had reached its height. Tens of thousands moved together, a living mass of people who had once been invisible. Gladiators stood beside shepherds, former slaves beside freeborn deserters from Rome's allies. Families followed behind the fighters, protected as best as circumstances allowed. Rome saw this and grew uneasy. This was no longer a simple military problem. The longer the rebels endured, the more they challenged Rome's sense of permanence. Empires relied not only on power, but on belief that resistance was futile, that order was natural. Winter eroded that belief. In the Senate, voices grew sharper. Delays were no longer tolerated. Losses, however small, were magnified by fear of precedent. The Republic could not afford patience. Yet for all Rome's growing urgency, this winter belonged to Spartacus. He chose engagements carefully, never allowing the rebels to be fixed in one place for long. He avoided large-scale confrontation, denying Rome the decisive victory it craved. Each success bought time. Each delay frustrated Roman planning. Still, beneath the surface of confidence, cracks formed. Supplies strained. Illness spread through crowded camps. Some men grew restless, questioning the long-term purpose of the struggle. Without the promise of escape beyond the Alps, the future felt increasingly narrow. Spartacus addressed this not with grand vision, but with honesty. This was never meant to be easy, he reminded them. But neither was it meant to be meaningless. He spoke of what they had already changed, not laws or governments, but certainty. Rome no longer moved without caution. Masters slept less soundly. Slaves listened more closely. Even if this ended tomorrow, the memory would remain. That knowledge steadied them. Victories continued into the deep of winter, enough to keep hope alive, but not enough to end the war. Rome was learning. Its commanders avoided traps more skillfully now. The rebels' margin for error shrank with every encounter. And somewhere to the south, preparations were underway. A new kind of enemy was being assembled, not one that sought glory or speed, but finality. This commander would not chase blindly or rush to battle. He would build walls where others charged. He would wait where others hurried. Spartacus felt the shift before he knew the name. Scouts reported changes in Roman movement, slower, heavier, more deliberate. Camps fortified with unusual care. Roads blocked, not patrolled. The war was hardening into something colder, more methodical. The winter victories had drawn Rome's full attention. They had also bought time precious, finite time. One evening, as snow fell lightly over the camp, Spartacus stood watching men huddle around fires, sharing warmth and food. Children slept wrapped in borrowed cloaks. Fighters cleaned weapons with quiet focus. This, he knew, was the height, not the peak of power, but of possibility. The moment when the rebels were strongest, most unified, most alive to the idea that they could choose their fate. Winter would not last forever, neither would Rome's patience, and as the season slowly turned, carrying with it the promise of spring and bloodshed, Spartacus understood that the war was entering a new phase, one where survival alone would no longer be enough. The victories of winter had proven what was possible. What came next would decide what would remain. Rome did not send hope to end the war, it sent certainty. When word reached the rebel camps that a new commander had been appointed, the name carried weight even before the man arrived, not because of past victories in battle, but because of reputation, wealth, influence, discipline sharpened by ambition rather than fear. Marcus Licinius Crassus. For Spartacus, the meaning was immediate and unmistakable. Rome was no longer experimenting. It was no longer reacting. It had chosen to finish this. Crassus took command with methodical calm. He did not rush to engage. He did not underestimate his enemy. He studied reports, terrain, supply routes. He listened to failures as carefully as others listened to triumphs. Where previous commanders had sought glory, Crassus sought control. And control, he believed, was achieved through fear. The legions under his command felt the change at once. Discipline tightened. Punishments grew harsher. A unit that faltered was not merely corrected, it was humiliated, broken down, rebuilt. Crassus revived an ancient Roman practice, long unused: decimation. 1 man in 10 executed by his own comrades for failure. The message was clear. There would be no retreat, no excuses, no mercy for weakness. News of this reached Spartacus through scouts and deserters, filtering northward like a cold wind. The rebels felt it too, not yet in battle, but in the tightening of the land. Roman camps appeared where none had been before. Roads closed, supplies vanished, movement grew harder. Crassus was not chasing them, he was enclosing them. Spartacus gathered his commanders and listened to their reports. The pattern was unmistakable. Rome was no longer trying to catch the rebels in motion. It was building boundaries, walls of steel, earth, and patience. The Republic had decided to starve the rebellion rather than fight it on uncertain terms. This was a different kind of war, one that rewarded endurance over brilliance. Spartacus adjusted as best he could. Raids became bolder, more urgent. Roman positions were tested repeatedly, probing for gaps. But Crassus responded not with pursuit, but reinforcement. Where a breach appeared, it was sealed. Where a road was threatened, it was fortified. Each success brought diminishing returns. The rebels still fought fiercely, but the cost grew heavier. Losses mounted, supplies thinned. The sense of open movement that had defined earlier months faded, replaced by corridors of pressure. Crassus watched and waited. He allowed small defeats, understanding they brought something greater. Time. Time to tighten the net. Time to drain strength. Time to turn winter's survival into spring's desperation. One of Spartacus's greatest challenges now was morale. The men had followed him through escape, victory, and uncertainty. But this phase demanded something harder. Patience under suffocation. Not everyone could endure that. Some deserted in small groups, slipping away under cover of night. Others argued for drastic action, either a desperate march south or an immediate attempt to break through Roman lines. Spartacus felt the strain deeply. Leadership had once meant choosing direction. Now it meant choosing restraint. He understood Crassus's strategy well enough to know that rash movement would play directly into Roman hands. A single poorly timed battle could end everything. So he waited, carefully, painfully. Rome, however, did not intend to wait forever. Crassus began construction of a massive defensive line across the narrowest part of southern Italy. Ditches, walls, fortifications stretching from coast to coast, not to defend Rome, but to trap its enemies. When news of the wall spread through the rebel camps, fear rippled openly for the first time. This was not how Rome usually fought its own land. The scale of the effort revealed intent, annihilation, not suppression. Spartacus called a council. Voices rose, some demanded immediate action. Others argued the wall was unfinished, vulnerable. Still others feared that any attempt to break through would destroy them. Spartacus listened, then spoke quietly. "Walls are built because someone is afraid of what lies on the other side," he said. The words did not promise victory. They reminded the men that Rome too felt pressure, that the empire had been forced into extraordinary measures by extraordinary resistance. They would not wait to be sealed in. The plan that followed was risky, desperate, and born of necessity. Under cover of darkness and storm, Spartacus led a force against the Roman fortifications at their weakest point. The weather worked in their favour. Rain flooding ditches, wind masking movement. For a moment, it worked. The rebels breached the line, forcing passage where Rome had not expected it. Cheers did not rise. There was no time. They moved hard and fast, dragging supplies, wounded, and families through the gap before it could be closed. But the cost was severe. Roman counterattacks followed swiftly. Casualties mounted. Cohesion frayed. The rebels escaped containment, but not consequence. They were no longer merely pressured. They were hunted. Crassus did not panic. He adapted. He split his forces, sending detachments to shadow the rebels relentlessly. He denied them rest, space, and certainty. Each day became a struggle not for victory, but for survival. Spartacus felt the difference in every decision. Earlier, he had shaped events. Now, he reacted to them. The initiative was slipping from his grasp, not because of lack of skill, but because Rome had finally committed its full weight. Yet even now, Spartacus refused to surrender the one thing Crassus could not take: choice. As spring approached, the war entered its most unforgiving stage. The rebels were battered but unbroken. Rome was relentless but cautious. Both sides understood that resolution was coming, and that it would not be gentle. Somewhere between the Roman walls and the rebel camps, the fate of the uprising narrowed to a single truth. This was no longer about escape. It was no longer about victory. It was about how the story would end, and who would still be standing when Rome finally closed its hand. Spring arrived quietly, without mercy. The rains softened the earth, but they did not soften the war. Fields turned to mud, rivers swelled, and the Italian countryside, once a place of movement and concealment, became heavy and slow. For the rebels, this change brought no relief. It only made escape more difficult. For Spartacus, the signs were unmistakable. The land itself was beginning to work against them. After breaking through Crassus's fortifications, the rebels had gained space, but not freedom. Roman forces shadowed them relentlessly now, appearing on ridgelines, blocking roads, cutting off access to supplies before the rebels even knew they were needed. Every movement was observed. Every pause invited pressure. Crassus had learned his enemy. He didn't rush to crush them outright. He allowed exhaustion to do its work. Hunger, cold nights, the slow erosion of morale. Where Spartacus had once chosen when and where to fight, now those choices narrowed with each passing day. The rebels split into smaller groups at times, hoping speed might replace strength. But Rome adapted again, sending detachments to harass, isolate, and destroy any force that strayed too far from the whole. Reunions became harder, communication less reliable. Unity, once their greatest strength, was under siege. Within the camps, tension grew. Some men argued openly now, others withdrew into silence. The families who had followed the fighters suffered most, slowing movement and complicating decisions. Spartacus felt the weight of every life pressing against him. Each path forward seemed to demand sacrifice. Crassus pressed harder. Roman patrols denied access to coastal escape routes. Negotiations with pirates, desperate attempts to secure ships failed, undone by betrayal and Rome's influence. Each lost opportunity closed another door. The rebels were being herded. Spartacus recognized the pattern with grim clarity. This was not pursuit. It was shaping the battlefield, forcing the rebels toward ground Rome had chosen carefully. Toward finality. One evening, as the rebels camped among low hills, Spartacus walked the perimeter alone. Fires burned low. The men spoke softly, conserving strength. He saw fear in their eyes, not panic, but understanding. They knew what was coming. So did he. This was no longer a war of movement. It was becoming a war of endurance and resolve. Rome had numbers. Rome had supply lines. Rome had nowhere to retreat, and that made it dangerous. Spartacus gathered his closest commanders. They spoke openly, without illusion. The rebels could not outrun Rome forever. They could not feed themselves indefinitely under this pressure. Another attempt at escape might scatter them, but scattering meant abandoning those who could not keep up. There was only one option left that preserved dignity: to fight. Not as fugitives scrambling for space, but as a force choosing its ground, its moment, its end. The decision did not come easily, but once made, it settled with surprising calm. They would seek battle on their own terms. Preparation began immediately. Spartacus reorganized the fighters, placing experienced men where they could steady the less trained. Weapons were redistributed, armor repaired where possible. The wounded were tended to as best they could be, knowing many would not survive what lay ahead. There were no speeches filled with promises. Spartacus spoke quietly to small groups, reminding them of how far they had come, not in miles, but in meaning. He did not promise survival. He promised choice. "We fight because we choose to," he said more than once, "not because we are driven." That distinction mattered. Rome sensed the shift as well. Crassus tightened his formations, preparing for the confrontation he had engineered. He chose terrain that favored discipline and numbers, flat ground, clear lines of sight, no room for ambush or escape. He was confident but not careless. Crassus knew Spartacus was dangerous precisely because he understood Roman methods. The final battle would not be rushed. It would be overwhelming. As the two forces moved toward one another, the countryside fell unnaturally quiet. Villages emptied, farmers hid. Word traveled quickly that something decisive was approaching. The rebels marched with grim focus. There was no longer debate about direction or purpose. Whatever disagreements had existed were quieted by necessity. The men walked beside one another, not as slaves, not as runaways, but as people who had chosen to stand together when retreat was no longer possible. On the eve of battle, Spartacus walked among them one last time. He did not stand apart. He did not elevate himself above the others. He shared food. He listened. He clasped shoulders. He looked men in the eye, committing their faces to memory. Many asked him questions he could not answer. Would they win? Would Rome fall back? Would this mean something? Spartacus answered only what he knew. "This already means something," he said. That night, sleep came rarely. Some prayed, some sharpened blades, some stared into the dark, thinking of places they might never see again. The air felt heavy, charged with the knowledge that dawn would not be ordinary. Across the field, Roman camps glowed with order and readiness. Standards stood firm. Trumpets were prepared. Crassus had done everything possible to ensure control. But control was not the same as certainty. As the first light of morning crept across the land, both sides took their positions. The distance between them closed not in a rush, but with deliberate steps. Spartacus stood at the front, not because he sought glory, but because he would not ask others to go where he would not. The walls, the traps, the narrowing choices, all had led to this moment. Rome believed it was about to end a rebellion. Spartacus knew it was about to define one. Whatever happened next would echo beyond the battlefield into memory, into fear, into the quiet knowledge that even an empire could be forced to its limits by those it believed powerless. Steel caught the light. The tide, long held back, was about to turn one way or the other. The decision to fight did not end movement, it reshaped it. In the days following the choice, the rebel force shifted northward once more, not in hope of escape, but in search of ground that might grant them one final advantage. Every step now carried the weight of inevitability. Rome followed closely, no longer content to herd from a distance, but tightening formation with deliberate intent. For Spartacus, this march felt different from all that had come before. Earlier movements had carried possibility open roads, uncertain futures, choices still unfolding. This one felt like a narrowing corridor. bordered by steel and consequence. Yet there was no panic. If anything, the men moved with a quiet focus that surprised even themselves. Arguments faded. Old divisions softened. The endless debates over direction and destiny fell away, replaced by a shared understanding. Whatever lay ahead would be faced together. Rome's pressure intensified. Crassus's legions closed ranks, advancing in measured intervals, never overextending, never retreating. Supply lines remained intact. Camps were fortified nightly. The Romans moved like a wall in motion, slow, relentless, impossible to ignore. Scouts brought grim reports. Another Roman force was approaching from the north. Pompey, returning from campaigns abroad, had been summoned to ensure the rebellion would not escape annihilation. The trap was nearly complete. The rebels were being compressed between two jaws of iron. Spartacus gathered his commanders one final time. There was no confusion about the situation. Maps were unnecessary. Everyone could feel it in the land itself, the absence of open paths, the way Roman patrols appeared before roads were even taken. Rome had learned not just how the rebels fought, but how they thought. "We will not be crushed between them," Spartacus said quietly. The words were not a plan yet, just a refusal. They marched hard, forcing the pace despite exhaustion. Nights were short. Food was rationed carefully. The wounded were carried as long as strength allowed. No one was abandoned lightly. This was not an army retreating. It was a people choosing how to end their journey. Along the way, Spartacus walked among the men more often now. He did not need to command discipline. It had become instinct. Instead, he listened. He answered questions when he could. When he could not, he stayed present. Presence, he knew, mattered more than certainty. Some men spoke of families they would never see again. Others joked quietly, clinging to normality as a form of resistance. A few stared ahead in silence, conserving themselves for what was to come. No one asked Spartacus if they would win. They had moved beyond that question. As the terrain flattened, the options narrowed further. Hills gave way to open groundland that favored Roman formations and denied ambush. Spartacus understood the risk immediately, but he also recognized the necessity. They could not fight this war forever. If there was to be an end, it would come here. Rome's forces began to appear more openly now, standards visible on the horizon. Dust clouds rising with unmistakable rhythm. The scale of the enemy was impossible to deny. Legion after legion, hardened by discipline and fear of punishment, advanced with grim resolve. Crassus wanted a decisive battle. So did Spartacus, but for very different reasons. The rebels halted on ground chosen not because it was perfect, but because it was sufficient. The land offered little shelter, but enough space to form lines, to maneuver briefly, to meet Rome face to face rather than be run down from behind. Preparation was swift and sober. There were no speeches promising victory. Spartacus spoke only to small groups, reminding them of simple truths. They had lived as free people. They had chosen each step. No one here was being driven into battle by a master's command. If you stand, he told them, you stand because you choose to. Some wept quietly at that. Others nodded. A few walked away under cover of night, choosing survival elsewhere. Spartacus did not stop them. He watched them go with the same calm acceptance he had shown all along. Freedom meant allowing departure as much as it meant resistance. By dawn, those who remained formed up. There were fewer now, many thousands, but not enough to match Rome's numbers. Still, They stood with weapons ready, armor worn thin but serviceable, faces marked by hunger and resolve. Across the field, Roman lines assembled with precision. Trumpets sounded, commands carried clearly in the morning air, shields locked, spears angled forward. Crassus watched from the rear, unreadable. Spartacus stood at the front. He did not wear ornate armor. He carried no standard. He did not elevate himself above the others. He stood where the danger would be greatest, not out of bravado, but out of principle. This was the last march, and it had ended exactly where it needed to. Not at the walls of Rome, not beyond the Alps, but here on open ground, where choice could no longer be deferred. As the two forces faced one another, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Wind moved through dry grass. Dust settled. Time stretched thin. Spartacus looked down the line of men who had followed him from chains to mountains, from escape to open war. He saw not soldiers, but individuals, each with a story Rome had never cared to hear. This was not a battle for conquest. It was a statement. When the signal finally came, it did not feel sudden. It felt expected, like the closing of a circle that had begun the night the kitchen knives were taken in Capua. The rebels surged forward not with perfect formation, but with purpose. Rome met them with disciplined force. Steel struck steel. Shouts rose. The field dissolved into movement and noise, order and chaos colliding in equal measure. The battle was brutal, immediate, and consuming. Spartacus fought at the front, pressing forward with singular intent not to survive, but to break through. He sought Crassus, knowing that symbols mattered, that even an empire could falter if its certainty cracked. He did not reach him, but he reached something else. He reached the moment where fear fell away entirely, replaced by clarity, where every choice made since Capua aligned into a single act of refusal. Around him, the rebels fought fiercely, desperately, beautifully men who had nothing left to lose but the manner of their end. Rome's numbers told. Gradually, inexorably, the rebel line bent, then began to fracture. The pressure was too great, the space too open, the enemy too prepared. Still, the rebels did not break easily. They fought until weapons shattered, until bodies failed, until the field itself seemed to protest the violence unfolding upon it. And as the battle reached its terrible conclusion, one truth became unavoidable. This was not the end Rome had wanted. It was the end it would never forget. Morning broke without ceremony. The sun rose pale and distant, its light spreading across a field already marked by footprints, churned soil, and the quiet tension of two forces that knew this moment could not be undone. The air was cool, almost gentle, as if the land itself hesitated to witness what was about to occur. For Spartacus, there was no illusion left to strip away. Every path had narrowed into this single place. Every choice made since Capua had carried him here, to open ground where Rome's strength could finally be brought to bear without restraint. Across the field, the Roman legions stood in precise order. Shields locked, standards upright. Officers moved along the lines with measured authority. There was no anger in their formation, only resolve. These men had been disciplined by fear and trained by repetition. They did not question why they were here. They existed to end what stood before them. Between the two forces lay a silence heavier than sound. Spartacus stood at the front of the rebel line, weapon in hand, cloak shifting slightly in the morning breeze. Around him were men whose lives had been shaped by loss and refusal, gladiators hardened by the arena, labourers whose bodies bore the marks of years of unseen work, shepherds and deserters and the formerly forgotten. They did not look like an army, but they stood like one. The signal came. Roman trumpets cut through the stillness, sharp and commanding. The legions began their advance, shields rising, lines closing, the ground trembling faintly beneath their synchronized steps. Spartacus did not wait. He raised his weapon and moved forward, and the rebel force surged with him, not in perfect formation, but with raw intent. The space between them collapsed rapidly. Shouts rose, feet pounded, breath shortened. Then the lines met. The first impact was thunderous. Shield struck shield. Metal screamed against metal. The air filled with dust, sweat, and the sharp scent of iron. Cries of pain and command overlapped, dissolving into a single, relentless noise. Spartacus fought with focused urgency. He did not swing wildly. Every movement had purpose. Parry, strike, advance. He aimed not to survive, but to push through, to break the Roman center long enough to disrupt their cohesion. He knew the odds. He knew the numbers. But he also knew that Rome relied on order, and order could fracture. Around him, the rebels fought fiercely. They did not retreat easily. They pressed forward again and again, absorbing blows, answering them with desperate strength. Men fell, rose, fell again. Weapons shattered. Shields splintered. The field became a shifting mass of bodies and motion. For a time, it seemed possible. A Roman line bent. A standard wavered. Officers shouted commands more urgently now, voices strained by resistance they had not expected to last so long. Spartacus pushed toward the disturbance, carving a narrow path through the chaos. He could see Crassus's command position in the distance, still, guarded, unshaken. Rome adapted. Fresh troops rotated forward. Discipline reasserted itself. The Roman line thickened, pressing inward with renewed force. Where the rebels surged, the legions absorbed and countered. The field that had once seemed wide now felt suffocating. Losses mounted quickly. Men Spartacus had spoken with the night before fell beside him. Others disappeared into the crush, their fate unknown, but felt in the thinning of the line. The rebel formation began to fragment, not from cowardice, but from exhaustion and sheer pressure. Still, they fought. They fought because there was nowhere left to go. Spartacus felt the moment when momentum shifted irreversibly. It came not as panic, but as clarity. The Roman line was no longer bending. It was closing. He drove forward one last time, seeking a break that would not come. Accounts later would say he was wounded, though none could say when or how. In the chaos, time lost its shape. What remained was effort, breath, will. Spartacus continued to fight, even as the ground grew slick beneath his feet, even as space vanished around him. At some point, he fell to one knee. He rose again. Roman soldiers pressed in, drawn by recognition now, by the understanding that this man mattered. Spartacus met them head-on, refusing retreat, refusing capture. He fought as he had lived these past years, on his feet, by choice. The rebel line collapsed gradually, then suddenly. What had been resistance became pockets of struggle, then isolated stands. Some fought until weapons were gone, others until strength failed. A few broke away, fleeing northward, carrying the story with them. Rome did not pursue immediately. The field demanded attention. By the time the fighting ended, the sun stood higher, its light revealing the full cost of the battle. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, Roman and rebel alike, but the imbalance was unmistakable. The rebellion had been broken. Spartacus's body was never identified with certainty. Some said he fell surrounded by enemies. Others claimed he disappeared beneath the press of shields, his end indistinguishable from those who fought beside him. Rome searched, but found no single corpse to display, no clear ending to parade. In that absence, something unsettled remained. Crassus ordered the survivors dealt with swiftly. Thousands were captured. Punishment followed with calculated cruelty. Along the roads of southern Italy, crosses rose in grim succession, bearing the bodies of those who had dared to refuse Rome's order. The message was unmistakable. This is what defiance earns. Yet even as Rome imposed its answer, it could not undo what had happened. The battle had ended the rebellion, but it had also revealed something Rome could not erase. For years, enslaved men and women would remember that an army without a nation had stood against legions and forced the Republic to tremble. As dust settled on the battlefield, silence returned. Not the silence of peace, but of aftermath. Birds circled cautiously. The land absorbed blood and memory alike. Rome would record this as a victory. History would record it as something more complicated. A moment when the world briefly bent, when those meant to obey chose instead to stand, and when a man taken from the forests of Thrace forced an empire to meet him not in chains, but in battle. The war was over, but the story, unfinished, uncontained, had already begun its longer life. Rome reclaimed the land quickly. Fields were cleared, roads reopened, patrols resumed their familiar rhythms. To an empire skilled at restoration, disorder was something to be erased as efficiently as it was confronted. Within weeks, Italy appeared calm again, on the surface. But beneath that calm, the aftermath lingered. For Spartacus, there would be no trial, no procession, no public execution to mark the end. His body was never displayed. His death, though certain, remained indistinct, absorbed into the mass of fallen bodies on the field. Rome preferred certainty, yet here it had none. The man who had forced legions to march had vanished into silence. That absence unsettled many. Crassus ordered the punishment swiftly and publicly. Along the Appian Way, the great road leading from Capua to Rome, thousands of captured rebels were crucified, lined at intervals, stretching mile after mile. It was not meant as justice. It was instruction. Every traveller would see them. Every slave would understand the warning. Every master would feel reassured. The crosses stood for weeks, then months. Bodies decayed where they hung. Birds circled. The road remained open, forcing Rome to pass its own reminder daily. This, the Republic declared, was the cost of rebellion. Yet even as Rome enforced its lesson, it could not control how it was received. Some looked away in fear, others in grim satisfaction, but many, quietly, dangerously, looked and remembered. Slaves whispered names in kitchens and fields. Gladiators in other schools trained with new caution, new awareness. Even free citizens spoke more carefully about the order of things, about what might happen if pressure were applied in the right places. Rome had crushed the uprising. It had not crushed the question it raised. Crassus claimed victory, but it came with complication. Pompey, arriving late, captured scattered survivors and claimed credit as well, muddying the triumph. Politics resumed immediately. Glory was debated. Honors were negotiated. The rebellion became a tool in rival ambitions. Spartacus himself faded from official records quickly. Rome did not build monuments to its challengers. It did not encourage memory where fear might grow roots. Official histories reduced him to a dangerous criminal, a footnote in the long list of threats overcome by Roman order. But memory doesn't belong to records alone. In the countryside, stories persisted. Some exaggerated his strength, others softened his end. In some tellings, he survived and escaped. In others, he fell only after killing countless Romans. The details shifted, but the core remained. He had refused. For those who had followed him and survived, those who scattered north, who hid, who were recaptured, and returned to lives forever altered. The world could never fully return to what it had been. They carried knowledge Rome could not confiscate. They had stood together. They had chosen. They had forced Rome to bleed. Even defeat could not erase that. Years passed. The crosses came down. Fields were replanted. New slaves replaced the old. The machinery of empire resumed its patient work. Rome expanded again, confident in its restored authority. But cracks lingered. Future rebellions would rise, smaller, quieter, more cautious. Rome would respond faster, harsher, having learned the cost of delay. In that way, Spartacus changed the empire not by overthrowing it, but by teaching it fear. And fear always leaves a mark. Among philosophers and historians, the story became a question of meaning. Was Spartacus a hero, a bandit, a tragic figure doomed by circumstance? Rome preferred the last answer. It allowed admiration without obligation. Yet for those who lived without power, the answer was simpler. He was proof. Proof that the world Rome claimed was natural and eternal could be disrupted. Proof that obedience was enforced, not inherent. Proof that even the most controlled lives contained moments of choice. Spartacus had not freed the slaves of Rome, but he had freed the idea that resistance was impossible. That idea lingered, quietly dangerous, passed not through laws or proclamations, but through stories told at night, when masters slept and memory spoke freely. In one such story, told long after the roads were cleared, a father explained to his child why people sometimes chose paths that could only end badly. Because some lives, he said, are not meant to be long. They are meant to be loud enough to echo. Rome would never admit this. Empires rarely understand the power of the moments they fail to control. They record victories and forget what made them necessary. They remember order and overlook the cost. But history, with its longer patience, would remember differently. It would remember that a man taken in chains had taught Rome to build walls across its own land. That an army without a nation had forced the Republic to commit its full strength. That fear had travelled the Appian Way alongside crucifixion. And it would remember that even after defeat, Spartacus remained unfinished. His story unresolved enough to be retold, reshaped, and reclaimed by those who needed it. As the years went on, Rome's roads grew longer, its borders wider, its confidence restored. But somewhere beneath that confidence, a quiet truth endured. Order is not the absence of resistance, it is the memory of having survived it. And Rome, despite its victory, would never again forget the winter when slaves marched like an army, or the man whose name it tried and failed to erase. The rebellion had ended, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of remembrance. Night returns gently to the story, not the night of battle or fear, but a quieter darkness, the kind that settles after noise has faded, when memory begins its slow, careful work. Rome believed the end had been decisive. The crosses had stood. The legions had marched. Order, once shaken, had been restored. And yet, something remained. For Spartacus, there was no grave to visit, no monument to deface, no body to display in triumph. His ending dissolved into uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, Rome lost control of the story. Empires rely on endings. They need conclusions that affirm power, that reassure those who obey and frighten those who might not. Spartacus denied Rome that comfort. By disappearing into the anonymity of the fallen, he became harder to contain than any living rebel. In the years that followed, Rome spoke of him rarely and carefully. Official accounts reduced his life to danger and disorder, a necessary lesson in what happened when the natural order was challenged. His name appeared in histories as a warning, not an inspiration. But Rome did not own memory. In kitchens, after long days, slaves whispered his name as if testing whether it was still safe to say. In barracks and training yards, gladiators remembered that one of their own had broken free not alone, but together with others. In distant provinces, stories travelled slowly, carried by traders and travellers, changing shape as all stories do. Some said Spartacus had wanted to destroy Rome. Others said he only wanted to go home. Many said he had wanted something simpler, to live without permission. The truth mattered less than the feeling his story carried. He had not been born powerful. He had not inherited authority. He had not been protected by status or law. And yet he had forced Rome to respond. That alone altered the balance of the world, however briefly. Over time, the rebellion became something softer, more reflective. Poets hinted at it. Philosophers debated it quietly. Was Spartacus a criminal, or was Rome itself the crime? Such questions were dangerous. And so, they were asked indirectly, wrapped in metaphor and distance. But the question never vanished, because it was not really about Spartacus. It was about the limits of power and what happens when those limits are tested by people who have nothing left to lose. In distant years, other rebellions would rise and fall. Some would be crushed quickly. Others would change history outright. Each would be measured, consciously or not, against the memory of that first great refusal in Italy. None would begin in quite the same way. The world Spartacus had lived in did not transform overnight. Slavery endured. Empires expanded. Inequality found new shapes. Rome itself would last for centuries more, but it lasted with a scar, a memory that could not be legislated away. That scar reminded Rome that obedience was enforced, not natural, that fear worked, but only until it didn't, that even the most carefully built systems depended on the silence of those beneath them. Spartacus had broken that silence, and once broken, silence never fully returns. In the end, perhaps that is why his story endures, not because he won, but because he revealed something permanent. That freedom is not granted once and kept forever. It is imagined again and again, often in the most unlikely places. In a kitchen with stolen knives, on a mountain no one thought to guard, on a road lined with crosses meant to end hope, and in the quiet understanding that choice exists, even when the cost is unbearable. As we step away from this story now, let the noise of empire fade. Let the clamour of battle soften into distance. Imagine instead the hills of Thrace, once more the wind moving through grass. the ground firm beneath bare feet, a life before chains. That life mattered, and so did the choice to refuse losing it completely. Spartacus did not leave behind a kingdom, a law, or a throne. He left behind a question, one that has travelled farther than his army ever could, passed from voice to voice, century to century, asking gently but persistently, what would you do if obedience were no longer the safest option? Now, let the night close in. Let the road grow quiet. Let memory settle where it will. And as sleep comes, carry with you the calm truth at the heart of this story, that even in the shadow of empire, a single human choice can echo far beyond its moment, lingering softly, long after the world believes it has moved on.